During the First World War, there were many British soldiers who faced the ultimate punishment for military crimes and offences. For those men, they were led to the execution post, a wooden stake stuck into the ground, in the early morning, and they were then shot at dawn. The truth of these executions is much darker, as many of the soldiers condemned and executed in this way were in fact very young, and some were just teenagers who were a very long way from home, fighting a war they had little idea about. But on the 10th of December 1916, the first commissioned officer in the British military during the First World War was executed. Eric Poole was originally from Canada, but moved to England, but for desertion during the intense fighting of the Battle of the Somme, he was executed by firing squad. But what specifically did he do, and what caused his execution? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Eric Poole was born on the 20th of January 1885 in Nova Scotia, Canada. As a young man he joined up with the Canadian Army and served in the 63rd Regiment, the Halifax Rifles. But then before the First World War broke out, Poole emigrated and moved to England with his family, and he lived inside of the town of Guildford in Surrey. As the First World War took hold in Europe, following many different countries and nations declaring war on each other, there was a huge drive in Britain to get soldiers into the army. We've all seen the famous posters of Lord Kitchener pointing, saying your country needs you. But many people joined the war effort because they saw the idea of fighting in a foreign war as exciting and almost like a holiday. Men felt very proud to fight for their country, nation and king, and in the first weekend of the war, around 1,000 men an hour were signing up, which was actually not enough. In 1916, a law was passed to say that men had to join the war effort, regardless of if they wanted to or not, and this was known as conscription. Later, Powell's battalions were formed, groups of soldiers who were friends before the war, who would fight together, but ultimately die together. Eric Poole voluntarily enlisted early, in October 1914, in the City of London, and signed up with the Honourable Artillery Company. He was an experienced soldier, and was given officer training, and he then joined up with the West Yorkshire Regiment. 12 months later he was sent to the Western Front and the trenches to replace many officers who had been killed in the fighting, and in May 1916 he arrived near to Lens. The reality of the war was bleak. It was not a holiday. Neither was the situation at any point positive. Trenches were hellish and terrible places for soldiers to live. They were waterlogged, full of rats, and nasty problems such as trench foot arose. The injuries sustained on the battlefield were also horrific, and the soldiers had to deal with constant artillery barrages, with shells landing all around them every few minutes. Death was very much on the horizon for any soldier within the trenches. Now on the 7th of July 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, the battle in which the British military suffered their deadliest day in history, whilst fighting, Eric Poole was close to where a shell hit and exploded. Earth and mud covered him, burying him in a grave. Now this plagued him mentally, and he suffered badly with shell shock, a condition today akin to PTSD. Poole was evacuated from the front line and treated in a field hospital. He was then a month later discharged, and he was fit to rejoin his unit on the Somme, and he was placed in command of a platoon of soldiers, specifically C Company of the 11th West Yorkshire Regiment. But on the 5th of October 1916, during an attack in which his men were to push forward towards enemy trenches at Flers, Poole was nowhere to be seen. He had gone absent without leave, most probably haunted by his shell shock, and he was actually found wandering a few days later by British military police who arrested him. On the 24th of November 1916, Poole was brought to a court-martial proceeding in front of officers from the 23rd Division. There were 6 men who gave evidence about him absconding from the battlefield, but also a couple of defence witnesses, including a doctor, who claimed that Poole was suffering from a psychological condition so bad that he was actually unfit to command soldiers at the time of his arrest, and it was claimed that he should have been nowhere near the battlefield. Poole also stated that at the time when he went AWOL, he had been very confused and not in a very good place mentally. He also claimed he did not realise how serious it was for him to abandon his position and men and post, and how this could in a sense lead to execution. The officers in charge of the proceedings also claimed that Eric Poole had been suffering from a complete nervous collapse at the time in which he left his men, but nevertheless he was found guilty of a military charge and the offence of desertion, and with this was quite simply sentenced to death by firing squad. So the British condemned him, despite the fact he was a sick man, and today let's think of the gravity of that. The British would willingly execute a man who was mentally ill and suffering with the psychological effects of the environment he was placed in. Specifically, it was concluded in the court-martial that he was of sound mind and capable of appreciating the nature of his actions. This, of course, is very much debatable. The man who had the final say on the execution of Eric Poole was none other than Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, General Sir Douglas Haig. Haig confirmed the verdict and death sentence, stating that it was highly important that all ranks should realise that the law is the same for an officer as is a private. So Haig condemned Eric Poole to pretty much send a message to other officers in the British Army not to desert from their post. He was left inside of a military prison, and on the 10th of December 1916, Eric Poole was brought out from his prison cell and he was to be shot at dawn. Near to the town hall at Poperinge in West Flanders in Belgium, the 31-year-old was brought out in front of officers to a stake which had been secured in the ground. Out filed the firing squad, a group of British soldiers armed with their rifles, whose job it was to bring Eric Poole's life to an end. He was fastened to the stake, and a blindfold presumably was placed around his eyes so he could not see his final seconds. A priest offered a blessing before retreating, and then the commander in charge of the firing squad ordered his men to raise their rifles. They stood there with their weapons pointed at the target, a small piece of paper which had been pinned to the chest of Eric Poole over his heart. When the order was given, the soldiers fired straight into their target, bringing the life of the first officer in the British Army to be executed for military offences to an end. He was one of only 2 military commissioned officers during the First World War to be executed for such military offences such as desertion. Eric Poole's story is one which is tragic and terrible, and he was someone who was executed despite the fact he had been suffering with shell shock. Today the condition is understood a lot better, and he should never have been condemned for the crime of desertion. But there were hundreds more who were executed during World War I for these sort of military crimes, but very few of them were actually officers, most being privates and those lesser ranking soldiers who were given a certainly tougher sentence. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.